Hello, everyone. Let me say the quiet part out loud here at the beginning. Consciousness does not require God. And that sentence makes you angry. I want you to ask yourself, because if your belief system collapses the moment someone explains your mind without magic, that is not truth. That is dependency. Now, I'm not here to pretend consciousness is an easy topic. Consciousness is one of the hardest questions humans have ever asked. But here is what I am here to do today. I'm here to separate what we can show from what people merely say. I'm here to put the claim on the table that people keep using as a shortcut. They say consciousness proves God. They say your thoughts prove a soul. They say awareness cannot come from matter. Well, my response is very simple. That is not evidence. That is an opinion wearing a religious costume. And if you want to claim consciousness requires God, you need to do something religion almost never does in these conversations. You need to demonstrate it, people. Not assert it, not preach it, not feel it, but actually demonstrate it. Because right now, what we actually observe points the other direction. When the brain changes, consciousness changes. When the brain goes offline, consciousness goes offline. And when the brain is altered, conscious is altered. And let me finish with saying this. When the brain is destroyed, consciousness doesn't hang around to leave or write us a letter. I hope you guys know that's not hatred, and it's really not rebellion, and it's really not spiritual warfare. I mean, it's just basic reality. So today, we're going to talk about consciousness in plain English. And I'm going to show you why God did it. It's not an explanation. It is actually the ending of an explanation. And we're not going to do that here today. I'm CJ Everson, and welcome to The Jewish Skeptic. Now, before anyone tries to dodge, let's define the word consciousness. See, when I say consciousness, I mean subjective experience. I mean the inner sense of being here. I mean the fact that it feels like something to be you. You know, you're not just a robot moving around. There's a point of view behind your eyes, people. There's a world appearing to you. There's a stream of experience like sights and sounds and thoughts and emotions, memories, pain, joy, hunger, boredom, and even desire. That inner stream is what people point to and say, see, that's God. But here is the first big problem with that. Pointing at a mystery is not the same as proving your favorite answer. If I don't know what lighting is, I don't get to say it was Zeus and call it objective truth. If I don't understand earthquakes, I don't get to say that the god Poseidon is angry. And if I don't fully understand consciousness, I don't get to say, therefore, it's God. Like, that is a scientific conclusion. That is not how reality works. Now, let's talk about what we actually know when it comes to consciousness. So, here is the most important pattern you can't escape. Consciousness tracks the brain. Not vaguely, not poetically, not in just some way. It tracks the brain so tightly that modern medicine can switch it off, reshape it, and sometimes partially restore it. Now, let's start with the simplest example. Sleep. When you're in a deep sleep, your consciousness changes dramatically. You're not having the same kind of experience you have while awake. Now, let's go one level deeper. Anesthesia. You could be conscious one moment, and then the doctor gives you the drug, and your conscious world disappears. And then later, as the medicine or drugs, whatever you want to call it, it wears off, your conscious world returns. See, that is not a metaphor. That's not theology. This is actually observable. And researchers have spent years studying what anesthesia tends to do to brain communication and complexity, including large-scale network disconnections and reduced integration that correlate with unconsciousness, y'all. So, ask yourself a basic question. If consciousness is a soul that floats independently in biology, why does chemistry turn it down like a dimmer switch? Why can molecules change the level of your awareness? Why can a drug dose or medical dose dial your inner world on and off? You can believe anything you want. But what I'm saying is you can't pretend that this doesn't matter, because this is evidence. Now, I want to be careful here, because believers love to twist this point. They'll say, well, the soul is still there. It's just that the brain is like a radio, and anesthesia damages the receiver. Okay. That is a claim. Now, show evidence that the signal exists apart from the receiver. Because if you can't, all you have done is create an unfalsifiable story that can never be tested. And stories that cannot be tested are not objective truth. They're personal beliefs. Now let's talk about brain injury. If you damage the brain, you can damage memory. You can change personality. You can alter emotional regulation. You can change impulse control. You can actually change the sense of self. You can change what a person loves, fears, notices, and values. So, what is the simplest explanation, CJ? Well, the simplest explanation is that the machinery matters. The simplest explanation is that consciousness is not a ghost driving a body around like a car. The simplest explanation is that what we call mind depends on the organization and activity of the brain. Now, religious people often respond emotionally to this. They act like what I'm saying is insulting. But don't take it as an insult, because it's not insulting people. It is descriptive. And I say this all the time. If your religion requires you to deny what the brain obviously does, your religion is not describing reality. It is protecting a conclusion. And that is the entire point of today's episode. Now, here is where it gets even more serious, because consciousness is not just a philosophical talk show topic. It has real consequences. There are people in hospitals who appear unresponsive. Some of you can attest to that. I know I can from experience. They can't speak. They can't move. They can't follow commands. And for a long time, we assumed they were not conscious. But modern neuroscience has forced us to get more humble. Researchers have found evidence that a significant minority of unresponsive patients may show convert command following in brain activity tests. In some studies, around 1/4 of patients. Now, let that hit you. To me, that means a person can look gone on the outside and still be there on the inside. And we can sometimes detect that by measuring the brain's responses. Now, one well-known approach is called PCI. I'll put it up on the screen for you. Here's what that means in plain English. Instead of asking the brain politely what it is doing, researchers can gently perturb the brain and then measure how rich and complex the brain's response is. In the original PCI work, researchers used tools like TMS and EEG to perturb the cortex and measure complexity. And they found PCI could distinguish between conscious and unconscious states across conditions like wakefulness, sleep, and even anesthesia. And later studies applied this kind of approach to disorders of consciousness with the goal of improving diagnosis beyond behavior alone. Now, I'm not saying PCI is perfect. I'm not saying we have a magic consciousness meter. What I am saying is that this is direction real evidence points. We are building ways to estimate consciousness by brain dynamics, y'all. Not by prayer, not by scripture, not by metaphysical declarations, but by the brain itself. So if someone tells you consciousness requires God, here's a question you can ask them. Why is the best progress we have made coming from neuroscience and medicine instead of theology? See, if consciousness were fundamentally supernatural, we would expect supernatural methods to be more useful. But unfortunately, they are not. Now, this is the hard problem and why it doesn't rescue God, in my opinion. Now, I know what some of y'all are thinking. If you're really watching this and you're in tune to this, you're probably thinking, okay, the brain correlates with consciousness, but you still cannot explain why experience exists at all. You're talking about what philosopher David Chambers called the hard problem of consciousness, meaning the problem of why physical processes are accompanied by subjective experience. That is a real philosophical challenge, y'all. And here's my response to it. A hard problem is not a license to assert or insert any God figure whatsoever. A gap is no evidence. Mystery is not proof. If you say science has not fully solved subjective experiences, therefore God, you have committed a basic reasoning failure. You have jumped from we don't fully know yet to therefore my preferred ancient story is true. And that is not logic. That is wishful thinking. And it's worse than that, to be honest with you. Even if I grant you that consciousness is hard to explain, saying God did it does not explain it neither. It just renames it. You haven't explained how God creates experience. You haven't explained the mechanics behind it. You haven't explained why brain injuries change experience if the experience is produced somewhere else. You haven't explained why anesthesia switches the brain off. You haven't explained why different organisms show different degrees of cognitive integration. You just said God like it is a solution. But God is not a solution if it does not increase predictive power. If your explanation makes no testable predictions, it is not an explanation. It is a label. Just slap it on there, a label. Now, let's look at two major ways scientists actually explain consciousness without, the fancy wording. Try to keep it simple. So first, the spotlight and microphone idea. Global workspace, in other words. Your brain is doing tons of stuff in the background all the time. Most of it never reaches you. But sometimes a piece of information gets pushed to the front, like it steps into the spotlight and gets put on the microphone. So lots of different brain systems can use it at once. When that happens, you become aware of it. You can describe it, think about it, and use it to make choices. Second, the high unified is the experience idea. This is called integrated information. This one says consciousness has to do with how well a system combines information into one joined up experience. Not just separate pieces, but a single whole moment. This theory is controversial. Some people think it's compelling. Others think parts of it don't work or lean to like weird conclusions, y'all. Here's the point that matters for our conversation today, though. Even when scientists disagree, they're arguing about how the brain is organized and how it processes information. They're not arguing about invisible spirits moving neurons. This debate stays inside natural explanations, not outside of them. And researchers have even run big head-to-head tests where teams compare what these theories predict using shared data and agreed rules. And the headline isn't "God did it, y'all." The headline is, "This is a real active field where claims get tested against evidence." And to me, that is what truth seeking looks like. Now, I want to address a move people make that sounds deep, but it's actually irrelevant when you think about it. They'll say Christianity started from a Jew, or they will say Jesus was Jewish. Okay. Even if I grant that historical framing, it does not prove anything about consciousness. It does not prove a soul. It does not prove God. It does not prove that a text is objective truth. It is a biographical fact used as emotional leverage. And that is not how we decide what is real, people. Reality is not determined by lineage. Reality is determined by evidence. Now, let me be very direct. When someone says the Bible is objective truth, they're making a claim that cannot be used as evidence itself. If you use the Bible to prove the Bible, you are reasoning in a circle. I said all the time, that is circular reasoning. And when you apply that to consciousness, it usually looks like this, or around some type of ideology that looks like this. They say, humans are conscious, therefore we have souls, therefore God. But the middle step does not follow. You don't get soul just because experience exists. You don't get God just because you don't like material explanations. And the Bible itself is not a consciousness experience. It is not a neuroscience textbook. It is not a measurement tool. It is a library of ancient writings with theological claims. We got to put it in its right place. So if someone says consciousness requires God because the Bible says humans have breath, spirit, or soul, my response is simple. That is your belief. That is not proof. And if you are calling it objective truth, then you should be able to demonstrate it without presupposing the conclusion. Now, the whole God of the gaps pattern. I want to expose a pattern I see constantly, especially online, TikTok, and Facebook a lot. I feel like once you see it, you can't unsee this. So make sure y'all really pay attention to what I'm saying. People use God as a placeholder for whatever we have not fully explained yet. In ancient times, God was behind lightning. Then we understood electricity. Back then, God was behind disease. Then we understood germs. God was behind mental illness. Then we understood brain chemistry, trauma, and neuron development. Now, God is behind consciousness? If so, what do you think will happen if this God was really behind consciousness? The same thing that always happened will happen, if you ask me. The gap shrinks. The mystery territory gets smaller. And believers retreat deeper into whatever is left. Now, let me be fair. That does not prove God does not exist. But it does prove that we don't know yet is not evidence for God. And it proves that the argument consciousness proves God has a terrible track record as a explanatory strategy. Damn. Tripping over my own words, y'all. Don't y'all be laughing at me out there because I be stuttering sometimes. At least I ain't on here saying and so like some of these YouTubers do. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, even if consciousness comes from the brain, how do you get morality without God? And I want to pause and say something important because that is a different question. Consciousness and morality are connected in human life, but they are not the same argument. People often merge them because they want one religious package to solve every problem. But that is not how reality works, people. I say this all the time. If you want to argue morality, argue morality. Do not smuggle God into consciousness because you're afraid of the moral debate. We could talk about ethics and meaning in another episode, though. But today, we're focusing on a single claim. Does consciousness require God? And nothing about morality proves that it does. If it does, show me, people, and I'll change my stance. Now let's run through the top objections people throw out so they don't have to face the evidence. Objection 1. The brain is just a receiver, not a generator. Again, that is a story. Now, show evidence that experience continues when the brain is offline. Because a receiver story is convenient precisely because it cannot be tested. And claims that cannot be tested do not get to be called objective truth. Objection 2. Science cannot explain subjective experience. Yeah, the full story is incomplete. But incompleteness is not proof of God. And God did it is not a mechanic that you can use. Objection 3. Near-death experiences prove consciousness exists without the brain. Okay. Well, first, most near-death experiences occur in situations where the brain is under extreme stress, altered chemistry, and partial function. And memory function can be distorted. Second, even if someone had experiences under death, that does not demonstrate consciousness independent of brain tissue. It demonstrates that human brains can produce powerful experiences under extreme conditions. If you want to claim something else, you need controlled evidence. Objection 4. But you can't reduce love, beauty, meaning, or ah to neurons. Okay? First off, no one is reducing. No one is reducing them in a dismissive way whatsoever. Explaining a phenomenon does not devalue it. Knowing how music works does not ruin music. Knowing how love works does not make love fake. Knowing how consciousness arises does not make your life meaningless. That is a fear response, not an argument, folks. Now let's talk about a sensitive subject here, because I now want to move into evolution. So let's talk about evolution for a moment. And the reason I want to is because consciousness makes sense in a evolutionary frame, y'all. Organisms that can model the world, predict danger, they coordinate movement, and remember threats, and navigate social groups. You don't need a soul to explain why nervous systems become more complex. You need selection pressure. You need survival. You need reproduction. Different animals show different cognitive capacities. We argue about where to draw lines because measurement is hard, but the overall pattern is clear. More complex nervous systems correlate with more complex behavior and more complex information integration. That is exactly what you would expect if consciousness is tied to brain organization. It is not what you would expect if consciousness is a magical, on, off, soul substance, granted only to certain creatures for theological reasons. Now, let me tell you why consciousness is so popular as a religious argument. Consciousness feels intimate. It feels sacred. It feels like the one place science can't fully invade. People don't want consciousness to be physical because they fear what it would mean. They fear it would mean that they're not special, y'all. Them fearing it would mean they would die. They fear it would mean there's no cosmic parent watching them. So they turn to consciousness and they turn it into a religious fortress. But truth does not care about your comfort. Reality doesn't negotiate with your stress and anxiety. If your belief depends on mystery never shrinking, your belief is not a conclusion. It is a coping mechanism. And I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying that because it is the honest diagnosis. Now, I want to model intellectual honesty because that's where, that's what separating truth seeking from preaching takes. Here's what we can claim from a responsible standpoint. We can claim responsibly that consciousness strongly depends on the brain. We can responsibly claim that altering brain states alters conscious states. We can also claim that anesthesia and brain injury can reduce or eliminate consciousness, and that this is an active area of neuroscience research. We can claim that measures like PCI have been used to distinguish states of consciousness and to study disorders of consciousness. We can claim responsibly that leading theories are being tested in large collaborations, including direct comparisons between IIT and GNWT. Here's what we cannot responsibly claim. We cannot responsibly claim we have a final solved theory of subjective experience. We cannot responsibly claim that every theory is correct. We cannot responsibly claim that we know everything. But none of that rescues God as a necessity, because we don't fully know does not equal therefore God, people. And that is the trick religious arguments rely on. They don't prove God. They exploit their discomfort with uncertainty. So, here is my conclusion. And I want it to be unmissable. Conscious does not require God. It requires a functioning brain. You can still believe in a God if you want. And you can still believe in a soul if you want. But if you're calling that objective truth, you owe the world evidence. No scriptures, no traditions, no vibes, no fear. Evidence. And until you can demonstrate that consciousness exists independently of the brain, God did it is not an explanation. It is a conclusion that you inherited. It is a label that you prefer. It is a story you were trained to repeat. And training is not truth. If you disagree, I welcome it here on this channel. You guys know that. But don't bring me no sermons. Bring me observations. Bring me testable claims. Bring me data. Because consciousness doesn't require God. It requires a brain. And that is exactly what the evidence shows. And if you like this episode, where we break down the kind of topics I cover here, like consciousness, theology, religious history, philosophy, and why claims need evidence, hit like, subscribe, and share this with one person who thinks God is consciousness. Let's see if they can separate belief from proof. Remember, no fear, no dogma, just clarity. I'm CJ Everson, and I am the Jewish skeptic. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.
Do you know what I found? The more you know, the less you know.